welcome to another episode of Lexitecture, a podcast about words by word nerds and for you. My name is Ryan, and in each episode, my friend Amy and I will be talking about our two favorite words of the week, looking at their origins and history, and generally chatting about how they got to where they are today. If that sounds like your cup of tea, come along for the ride and let's explore the weird and wonderful world of the English language. In today's episode, Subliminal Riding.
Okay, the word that I've chosen is the word subliminal.
Ooh.
Subliminal. I'm just having a wee spelling bee moment to myself. And what the OED has to say about subliminal is that it is an adjective and it is defined in terms of psychology of a stimulus or mental process as below the threshold of sensation or consciousness, perceived by or affecting someone's mind without their being aware of it. The derivatives are given as subliminally, the adverb, and the origin, which is what I'm really interested in, late 19th century, from sub, below, plus Latin limen or limen, that's Limen, Limin. And this is the part of the word that I am most interested in, because the limen or limin means threshold. And for something to be subliminal, what it actually means is that it is underneath the threshold of a doorway. So a limen, the Latin word,
Right.
it's, I believe, etymologically linked to the word lintel that we would use. So I tend to think of a threshold as being the doorstep, the part that you physically step over.
Yeah.
Whereas this word, translated as threshold, refers to the top of the door, the horizontal top part. And so to be under the threshold, under the limen, means to walk through the door. Now, of course, when you get into things like Freudian psychoanalysis and the psychological aspect of it, the doors of the consciousness is a metaphor that's used quite commonly. And the idea that going through a door is a space between being in one place and then being in it's the bit in between being inside or outside. Mm-hmm. This is why I'm interested in this word. So as I looked it up to do a bit of research for this very purpose, I realised that the other interesting thing about this is that the origins often state that it is perhaps related to the word sublime, which is a bit of a... It's both logical and perhaps reaching a little bit. So that takes me to sublime, which the OED defines as an adjective, meaning of such excellence, grandeur, or beauty as to inspire great admiration or awe. Or as a verb, in chemistry, to change directly into a vapour when heated, typically forming a solid deposit again on cooling. And this brings me to, as it always does, because, this brings me to one of my most favourite quotations from a poet, the Scottish poet Hugh MacDiarmid, who you may or may not be familiar with. He's fairly obscure if you're outside Scotland or outside the UK, certainly. And MacDiarmid was a controversial figure in a lot of different ways, politically and in terms of his literature. But he said that he always wanted to be where extremes meet. And the idea of both the subliminal, in terms of things which happen underneath your conscious threshold, and the notion of the excellence of such a thing happening, plus that chemical definition of moving between states without any intermediary, makes me feel as though that place between one thing and the other can be quite nebulous and very, very interesting.
That's very cool.
And that, Ryan, is my word.
That's very neat. I hadn't actually put together, just phonetically, sublime, sublimation, and subliminal, that there would be a connection sort of makes sense. That's...
Oh, I've just noticed another definition. This sounds like how odd. I've just noticed another definition. Genuinely, I've just noticed another one. Of the verb to sublime. With an object, it says it's an archaic usage. It means to elevate to a high degree of moral or spiritual purity or excellence, which is kind of how I feel about this word.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense, because if you're going from, if the process of sublimation is to go from a solid to a gas without the normal intermediate step of a liquid, that's not a bad metaphor for the elevation of something from one kind of metaphysical plane to another.
And indeed, the elevation from one level of consciousness to another.
Yeah.
But of course, because I'm an incredibly visual imaginating, that's a word now, I just made it so.
Sure, yeah.
Because of that, what I really wonder is, what does the door look like?
Oh, right.
Because I want to picture a door. And, doors are interesting. Doors are cool. I took a tour of doorways when I was in Beijing. I forget what the specific name of that piece of culture was. Oh, it's very annoying that I can't remember. But it took us around different doorways in Beijing and looked at the significance of the design and the art and the layout of them. Doors are cool things, and they come in lots of different shapes and sizes. So I sort of wonder if there are doors within my consciousness, if there are doors between the ordinary and the excellent, what do the doors look like?
That is a fascinating thought. Huh, very cool. I have something much more mundane.
You said that last time.
I did say it last time. Maybe this is the theme. Maybe you're bringing the interesting stuff and I am tagging along, but we will find out. But
Ryan,
at least
we both know that we are much more interesting together.
It's true. It's true. The word that I have is riding, but it is the noun form of riding, which, as I found out, we have an election coming up in a number of weeks or months. I sometimes stop paying attention to these things in Ontario. And in Canada, and as I found out, this is apparently unique to Canada, our electoral districts are called ridings.
Ryan, I fear I must contradict you.
Okay.
Because ridings, well, the one that I am definitely aware of is that there is a West Riding of Yorkshire, which is an English county.
Yes.
And I'm interrupting your word. I'm sorry, I wasn't going to do this. But we watched an episode of Only Connect this week, Ross and I. Only Connect is a deliciously geeky quiz show. It's on BBC Two. You should check it out. It's really wonderful.
I will.
It's hosted by Victoria Corin Mitchell, who is a very excellent journalist and writer in her own right. But the other interesting thing about her is that she's married to David Mitchell of Peep Show fame.
Yes.
But she hosts this tremendously geeky quiz, and there are several different rounds, but essentially it's about making connections, bringing together these different things. And they have a connecting wall where there are 16 words that can be sorted into 4 connecting groups. And of course, there are lots of red herrings that fit into multiple groups. But one of the categories this week was national, I've forgotten the word that they use, basically ways of splitting up a country into administrative districts. And riding was one of the words that was used. So it's very interesting that I saw it on TV 3 or 4 days ago, and this is your word.
Yeah, that's cool.
Continue, and I won't interrupt.
Oh, sorry. So as I found out, according to a couple different sources, it seems that riding, it does indeed, as a method for subdividing sort of political boundaries and subdivisions themselves within a country. That comes from the UK, obviously, as so much of Canadian society does. But Like, what would you, when you talk about an MP in Scotland or in the UK more broadly, what do you call the area that they represent?
The constituency.
Yeah. So when an MP would go from the Houses of Parliament and then return back to the area in which they were originally elected, you would say they're returning to their constituency. Mm-hmm. So in Canada, we say that's their riding, and that's the only place we use it. But it's very, very common. It's just a word that's all over the place, especially obviously at election time. But I've never known what it meant and where we got it and where it came from, because it's a bit of a strange word to be a noun. And so it's been on my list of things to investigate, and this seemed like a good opportunity to do it. So I looked it up, and I looked it up in some online etymological dictionaries, as well as the venerable OED. And the OED has it, just to give the definition following along in your admirable way to start, which is to actually lead with authority. Imagine that. The B definition for riding as a noun, it says specifically in Canada, originally a subdivision of a county established primarily for electoral purposes, now historical, in later use an electoral district, a constituency. And it dates back to the late 18th century, as far as in print uses in Canada. And like I say, it's just a perfectly common, completely ordinary word now in political spheres to refer to the riding of an MP or an MPP at the provincial level. Mm-hmm. But where it comes from is indeed actually from tied to Yorkshire, and before that to sort of Denmark, actually. And it stems from an Old English and other kind of Proto-Germanic and Norse words that essentially are all either trithing or thriving is the words that it comes from. And it basically came up from, which shares a root with third, which is where that connection is. And so in Danish law and political boundaries, it was quite common to have, sort of fiefdoms or whatever, divided into 3 subdivisions for administrative purposes and for the ease of keeping the plebs in line, I'm sure. But they were called the third, or the thrithing, or the trithing, depending on the source, whether it's a T or a TH. And how they would be differentiated is they would be differentiated by the cardinal directions. So you would have north thrithing, east thrithing, west thrithing, which then, just again phonetically, because language tends to be lazy and drop things that are harder to say, the TH at the beginning, or the T at the beginning of thrithing or thriding, was sort of absorbed by the east, west, north, south, because they're the same. So they run on and eventually they just drop them. So instead of east trithing or east thriding, you would say east thrithing. And eventually that middle T would just get absorbed into the end of east, and it would become east riding or east writhing. And so that's how that transition happened. But it comes from this ancient way of dividing countries in the north of England and in Denmark, and apparently parts of northern Germany and Saxony and stuff, which makes sense as to how it got to England. But I was thinking from there, because it's related to third, but obviously the R and the I are in the reverse order, in thrithing or thriding, I decided to look into third, because these things, as you say, tend to take on a bit of a rabbit hole property to them. And I found out that for a long time, there was a lot of overlap, and like English has always had this thing before it became really codified in like sort of late 18th, early 19th century, when it became really stultified with prescriptive grammar and everything else. There was often a lot of ways to spell everything. There was no real universal spelling or grammar in English. And so for a long time, there were these 2 sections where some people and regions would say thrid and some would say third, because they would just switch around the IR at a whim. And so this went on for a couple centuries. According to the OED, the last use of thrid, Thrid, for third, is sort of the early 1600s. And that seems to be when the final kind of shift to the IR third happened. And then from then on, it's been as it is now. So that was the early 1600s. But Northumberland was, curiously, way ahead of everyone else, because the earliest use of third, where it switches from thrid to third, was in Northumberland, and it was in around the year 950.
Wow.
So for more than 600 years, nearly 700 years, in the UK, in England, there were these two different ways of pronouncing third, and it was either thrid or third. And there was an interesting, in the Rolls of Parliament in 1414, volume 4 for those interested, King Henry III was actually listed as King, Kyng, Henry the Thrid, Thridde. So it was quite common to have, and especially apparently in the highest of halls of power and most official of sources, thrid was just an absolutely equal way of saying third. And that's where riding comes from in Canada.
I can kind of feel, it seems reasonable. Thrid is it isn't a mouthful. Obviously, the THR cluster exists in lots and lots of other words, but thrid, there's something unpleasant about saying it. It's like what I was just saying about, I don't know why I like it, but I do. Sometimes a word, you don't really know why it feels odd. Third and thrid. Thrid just feels a little bit cumbersome.
Yeah.
It's also making me think about ask versus axe.
Yeah, exactly.
And that idea of the consonants switching position. And this makes me very interested because, of course, nowadays, because we're aware of how language has changed, and because we're able to see so much written language, so much more than I think than we used to, because of things like Facebook and online communication and all that stuff. It's all about the texting, isn't it? Everybody always brings that up. But people like to say, oh, but that's wrong and you can't do this and it's not right. And you think, well, actually, language is going to change. And what I really like is the fact that you brought up, this was the last time, really, that this word was being seen. And I kind of wonder, at what point, that there are going to be shifts within English, of course, that they're happening right now. At what point will we be able to say? And after that, nobody really used that word anymore.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting to think about that. What I like best about thesauruses is how far away from the actual meaning of the word synonyms can get.
Yes.
You know what I mean? So I thought it might be interesting to have a "Hey Roger, what do you say?" Sort of add on, like a little feature to say,
beautiful.
Here's a word, how far away can we get from it while still ostensibly meaning the same thing?
I love it. So,
"Hey Roger, what do you say?" Riding, in the context that you have it, there's so we have in the index riding, district, equitation, land travel, sport. So district, I think, is the most interesting one that we want there. Oh, there's some really fantastic words in here. I kind of feel like I want to just read them all out. Is that a bit boring?
No, I think a selection would be, it's here.
So the area in which I find riding is the sort of main thread of the word is subdivision. So we have state, province, county, shire, bailiwick, riding, laith, wapentake or wapentake, not sure. 100, soak. Rape, R-A-P-E. Tithing, diocese. Bishopric, archbishopric. Parish, ward. Constituency, borough. Community, township, municipality, county. District, metropolitan area. Canton, department, arrondissement, commune. Hamlet, village, town, market.
Wow.
I find myself really, really intrigued by bailiwick.
Bailiwick is quite cool. The other one where you said 100. Yeah.
Sorry?
When you got to 100, that reminded me of one of the other alternate uses of thriving or thriving. It was still related to 3, but it was related either to when a thing was divided into thirds or when in larger places it was divided into plots of 300s.
Ah. So subliminal, when I look it up in the alphabetical index, that's the word, has 3 sort of subcategories. And the first is psychic, which I'm finding quite interesting. The second is latent, also interesting. And the third one, most interesting of all, involuntary.
Oh.
Yeah. Doesn't that put an interesting spin on the word? I am, of course, imagining that that my hand is on the handle.
Right.
But in fact, when
the whole point of subliminal advertising, for instance, is done involuntarily.
Yeah.
So that you don't recognize that it's happening.
If I've been imprudent enough to leave the door open, then who knows what will get in.
I like that.
I don't think I need to go any further with that. I like that little...
No, I like that
I'm
a
actually
lot too.
not going to look anymore.
And that's it for this episode of Lexitecture. Thanks for listening, and if you enjoyed what you heard, please give us a rating and review on iTunes, and be sure to tell all your word nerd friends about us too. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter by searching Lexitecture, Lexitecture. And if you'd like to get in touch with us about the things we talked about this episode, you can send us an email at words@lexitecture.com. Special thanks to the Joy Drops for our theme music, and we'll talk to you again next week.